So Jubilee recently released an episode of Surrounded with one atheist surrounded by 25 Christians. And their atheist was no one other than the famous internet atheist Alex O'Connor. I feel like Alex keeps popping in my videos, but it just seems like when it comes to the discussion between Christianity and atheism, Alex is always the subject. Obviously, I was very interested in the video, so I watched the whole thing. If you haven't watched it, I will leave the link in my description box, so make sure you go ahead and watch it. So the whole setup involved 4 prompts or 4 objections that Alex had against Christianity in defense of atheism. And then you had basically Christians coming in, sitting down and debating. But overall, I would say the whole setup sort of favored Alex and the group of these Christians, which, you know, there was one guy, Jacob, who was a Mormon. I was like, how is it that like Jubilee thinks that Mormonism and Christianity is the same thing? Like, I don't know. And overall, there were some people who made good arguments for Christianity, but most people though were underprepared or they were not used to that kind of style of debating. And obviously Alex has the upper hand because he debates and interviews people on this subject, so he's more than prepared. So I do feel like the panel could have been better selected. You could have had more like real apologists of the faith. Anyway, so in today's video, I just want to react to the first prompt, the first objection that Alex made towards Christianity. Suffering makes God's existence unlikely. So this is the prompt that I will be reacting to in this video. I'm gonna watch it with you guys, that part where he raises this prompt, and after that I will give my own defense, you know, why I believe this whole objection against Christianity is just not a good argument. And I'll have mainly 4 or 5 points that will make why I believe this is a terrible argument against Christianity.
Why is suffering or evil make God's existence unlikely?
I think when confronted with 2 hypotheses, atheism, naturalism, or theism, we should ask what we expect would occur under either hypothesis. And then we look at the world and we see what does actually occur. We find a system of natural selection, the mechanism by which God apparently chose to bring animals and ultimately human beings into existence. A system which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with suffering, such that 99.9% of all the species, let alone animals, that have ever existed on planet Earth have been brutally wiped from existence. And I think that that's less likely on theism. If you assume atheism or materialism, not only do you explain this, you also come to expect it.
Would you say that theism or atheism better account for the idea that suffering exists and a purpose for it?
Depends exactly what you mean, because of course you might say that the world itself is more expected on theism, and since suffering needs the existence of the world, that it's theism, but granted the existence of a material world, let's say, I think atheism.
Would you agree that consciousness is necessary for suffering?
I would say probably, yeah.
Does atheism account for consciousness?
Yes, that's what I was talking about a moment ago. Perhaps not. Maybe theism accounts better for consciousness than atheism does.
So if there is no consciousness, there is no suffering. Is that right?
That's probably true, yeah.
So if atheism cannot account for consciousness, then it cannot account for suffering. Would you agree with that?
So I think what we're doing here is we're sort of slightly shifting the goalpost. If you don't want to grant the existence of the material world before we start talking about this, we can do an argument from consciousness, but then we need to debate whether consciousness is explicable on atheism. What I'm going to say is this. Sure. What I'm going to say is this. Consciousness may seem to imply the existence of a conscious creator of the universe. We're here talking about, I suppose we're talking about Christianity, and the claim was about God, but the God that you believe in, let's say, if we grant that there is a creator deity who sort of brings about the universe of conscious creatures, have you ever heard of the evil God hypothesis that Stephen Law popularized or came up with?
Tell me it.
So the idea is that, like, imagine that there's a God who brings about the world and creates the world, but does it maliciously because he wants human beings to suffer. He brings about a world in order so that human beings will suffer. Right? That seems like a plausible hypothesis. And even if you think that consciousness points towards God, the kind of God that a lot of Christians think is a sort of necessary quality of God, which is to be all loving, might not have to apply here.
All right, guys, there's a lot there, but I want to dissect. Does suffering truly cancel out the possibility of God's existence? Can we really make that correlation? So let's say we're going to use, this framework, because obviously we're assuming the suffering is bad, that somehow, it could be a product of an evil God. He does include this hypothesis of the evil God. And because of that, God must not exist. But I can make sort of the same counter argument and say, because there's so much good in the world, right? We see that the world is set up where you have the fine tuning of the universe, where you have the oxygen levels that are just right, the gravitational force that is just right, all of these different factors, not just one factor, but a plethora of different forces and factors that allow for human existence. And when I look look at the totality of it all, I see the goodness of it all, and therefore there must be a good and awesome God who loves humanity. In the sense, I'm using that framework that Alex made with existence of suffering and the cancellation of God. So you kind of can flip the argument. And what atheists do with this argument is that they completely shut their eyes towards the good that is in the world, and they completely focus on the suffering. And here's the thing, if you have enough faith to believe that God somehow should remove all the suffering, that he should be powerful enough to remove all suffering from the earth, could you then also, by that kind of worldview, assume that God is also infinitely knowing? He knows better than you do as a human in your finite mind, and that he would have reasons to allow suffering to exist, the reasons that are beyond your understanding. The next point that I want to make is that I know he brings a lot about the animals and somehow, this innocence of animals, but you have to understand that the story when it comes to suffering, it has to do with us, and animals suffer by product. Everything's connected, but the question of suffering and God is really between man and God. It's not really between God and the animals. In fact, the Bible insists that's not the kind of world that the God created. The kind of world that God created was good, was perfect. There was no death, there was no suffering, there was no killing. It was a perfect universe. And here's the thing, how is it that we ascribe all the suffering in the world, and let's say even evil in the world, onto God, as if we as humans have no part, have no play in it? Are our hands clean when it comes to suffering? Or are we also as humans partakers in that suffering? And maybe there's so much suffering because we are part of the story. How is it it's just suffering God and there's no human involvement? We play a part in the story, and that's what the Christian narrative, the Christian tradition insists, is that there is suffering in the world because we sinned. We fell short. This was not the world that God intended for us to live in, but because we disobeyed, we strayed, because we were given free will, we decided to part ways with God because there's consequences, So this idea that, all suffering in the world is a result of a bad God or non-existent God is just not true. We know instinctively as human beings that suffering is not just something that is meaningless. Because think about it, like we all love stories that are filled with suffering, and agony and all of this. And then there's this redemption at the end. Just because a story has a lot of suffering in it doesn't mean it doesn't have an author. Obviously not. Alex wants to if it does have an author, it must be an evil author because clearly there's no redemption. And here's the thing, that's only true if you assume there is no life after death. If you believe that's, there's nothing beyond the grave. Most people do believe that their life will truly echo beyond, because there are things that we cannot explain. There are things that are far beyond us, like consciousness, So the last point that I want to make, the reason why Christianity is unlike any other religions is because we have a suffering Lord. You could make all of these objections against God and the suffering, and if Jesus didn't come and die for our sins. We have a suffering God. That's the uniqueness of Christianity. The reason why people sometimes wonder, why did Jesus have to die on a cross and take the sins of the world? Because of this very reason. Because atheists could then, if Jesus had not died on the cross, they could make this objection and say, what? Because there's so much suffering in the world, that means God doesn't care. So we could understand that God is deeply involved with the story of humanity, that God came to redeem our suffering. He came to die for our sins. So we could not make this case, because there's a bunch of suffering in the world, that means God is evil. He could only be evil had he not incarnated and come down to redeem the suffering. And that is the story that God is writing. This world is fallen, it's full of suffering, but this is only temporary because better things are to come. There's going to be new heaven and new earth. There is redemption coming. So this is especially demonstrated in the book of Job, which is a book of wisdom in the Bible, which talks about the long suffering of Job. If you're not familiar with the story of Job, if you are not a believer, familiarize with it. But this man went through so much suffering, unjustified. He was blameless before God, but God allowed suffering in his life. And I love how God confronts Job whenever he's complaining and he just feels completely like he doesn't understand what's happening in his life. And this is how God confronts Job. And I think this is powerful. And let me read it to you. And I want to make this very interesting point. It's Job 38, verses 4 through 11. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched the measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped in its thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it, set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come and no further. Here is where your proud waves halt. So God confronts Job. Where were you when I was laying down the earth's foundation? What God does here is he says, Job, look, if I have this creative power to lay the earth's foundation exactly how I want, do you think I cannot redeem your suffering? That is essentially the question that God is asking Job. Do you think, Job, that I cannot redeem your suffering? If I am powerful enough to set this whole world in motion, this whole universe in motion, do you think I have no power to redeem your suffering? So the greatest objection against atheism is this created world in its magnificence, in its power, in its like who created all this? And God says, I created all this. And because I created all this, I am powerful, even if there is suffering for a short while. Do you think I cannot redeem it? Do you think I have no power to redeem it? And if I allow this suffering, do you think I do not have good reasons to allow it? And that is where we have to take a step of faith. I used to not understand this kind of, language that God was using, when confronting Job, but only now I understand the beauty and the wisdom of it. So in a sense, yeah, I would agree with Alex, because there's suffering in the world, God's existence is unlikely. But that is a very reductionistic view. And like I said, I can make the same claim and say, well, there's a lot of good in the world. Therefore, there must be God who sustains this whole system. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I know this is going to be a very heady and a very kind of, hard topic to wrap your mind around. But I think as Christians, we need to be able to articulate our faith, to really show holes in people's theories, because atheists, they make these claims as if they're absolutes when they're completely full of holes. I believe atheism is just a pseudo religion. I feel like atheists claim to be materialists, but they certainly don't live or act like materialists. They definitely act like people who are defending a religion. That's for sure. Consider liking this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Consider subscribing to my channel if you have not. And I'll see you guys in the next video.